STEM City USA Healthy Doses series is your passport to a balanced lifestyle. Hosted by Dr. Tiffany Anderson and presented in the Boston Scientific Auditorium. And now, Dr. Tiffany Anderson.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Healthy Doses. Today's episode is brought to you by Boston Scientific, and we are streaming live in the metaverse from STEM City, USA. Welcome, everybody. We thank you for joining us. Healthy Doses is a show that we put together to give you the tips, tools, and resources that you need to be the best you possible. And we do that by tackling mental health topics every week. And so I want to introduce you to our mental health expert, Dr. Tiffany Anderson.
Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us for Healthy Doses. I am your host, Dr. Anderson, and today we will be tackling the topic of grief. It may be a little bit heavy for some. I just ask that you all kind of follow with me. And again, this is more informational, just so we can know what it looks like and how it may be showing up in some of our lives, and provide you all with some tips to kind of get past it or manage it, right? So first, I want to start with a few myths about grief and how you hear about these things that are supposed to happen and they're not realistic, right? So I'm going to start with myth number one. The pain will go away faster if you ignore it. No, that is not true. That is not reality. The thing with grief is we actually have to address it for it to get better and for us to recognize how it is showing up in our lives, right? And so if you ignore it, it only kind of worsens in the long run. So it is necessary to face grief as it comes, oftentimes coming in waves, and deal with it for that natural healing, right? So we want to confront it. We don't want to run away from it. Number two, it's important to be strong in the face of loss. You do not have to be strong. No one is asking you to be strong. And if they are, that is an unrealistic expectation of you that you do not have to follow. The thing with loss of any sort, it does take a hit to our spirits, right? And it does cause us to kind of question our lives and what it looks like without that thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be a person, right? But without that life experience. And so it is okay to feel sad. It is okay to feel lonely. It is okay to feel kind of like unbalanced. That is expected of you. Crying does not mean you are weak in any way. You don't need to protect family members or friends from your emotions or their own. That is not your job. You can absolutely be in the midst of your emotions and still be supported, okay? Number three, if you don't cry, you aren't sorry for the loss. You don't have to cry. Everyone doesn't show their emotions with tears, right? So a person who may cry or may not cry may be suffering the same. Or worse, right? And so you don't have to show your grief through tears. And I just want to normalize that for those that don't always cry when they experience a loss. The last one is grief should last about a year. Not true. Grief could last less than a year. It can last longer than a year, right? There's no right or wrong time frame for grieving. It's different from person to person. And I just, again, want to normalize that for our audience to let you all know that even if you're still grieving after years of losing someone or something, just know that that is completely okay. That is normal. We'll talk about what that looks like in its complete severity, but recognizing that it differs from person to person, and that's okay. So we're going to jump right back in after this commercial break from our sponsors, Boston Scientific.
everybody, and thank you for joining us for this important topic on grief. This is episode 10 of Healthy Doses with you and I, Dr. Anderson. What do you think about that? How do you feel? Because we're really doing this thing.
Really, that's how I feel. Like we're really doing it. I think when we started with the idea and the concept, it didn't feel real for me. I was really nervous and anxious about what this would look like and what we would create. And I'm really proud of us. I'm really proud of us and that we've been consistent, that we are showing up for each other, showing up for ourselves and our audience members, and that we're actually having fun. And that's all I wanted. I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to enjoy it. And I have a great moderator to do that with. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Anderson, and thank you to the audience, because we couldn't do this without you, and we're doing it for you. So thank you for doing that. So before we get into today's topic, which is on grief, I do want to remind you, the audience at home, that there are ways that you can participate. There are ways that you can interact with both Dr. Anderson and I, and that's by asking questions, dropping comments in the chat wherever you're watching. And just letting us know what you think on the topic. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot them our way. If you're watching on your computer and you have access to your phone, open your camera and you can scan that QR code right above Dr. Anderson's head. You scan that code, you can send us questions anonymously. You can put your name in if you want us to shout you out. And you can just send us, whatever your thoughts are on the topic. If you are watching in the metaverse, there is a chat button to the left of your screen. You can click there and you can really interact with everybody that's watching the show. Leave comments for each other, drop questions in there for us. But yeah, we just want to hear from you. So participate with us. Let us know what you think. With that being said, Dr. Anderson, I want to really go into this topic of grief, right? We all experience it. We all have been through it in some way, shape, or form. But I don't know if I've ever actually heard the definition of grief. I know what it feels like. I know but what is the official definition? What is grief?
What is grief? When you dive into anything, you're going to find, kind of multiple definitions of grief. But what we find, the similarities across the board is this kind of keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss, right? So it's the sense of kind of deep sorrow or painful regret, right? And so that's usually how we kind of identify grief. And what we see most often is grief being associated with a loss of an individual, but we do recognize that it expands beyond a loss of a person, right? So a few examples of what may cause someone to grieve, right? So again, we know the loss of a person or a loved one, but also what about the loss of a job? What about the loss of a beloved pet? I am a dog mom. So just, that idea, that experience would absolutely cause me grief. A loss of a friendship. It doesn't have to, they don't have to be physically gone from the physical realm, right? But the friendship may be lost. A loss of a personal dream. That hit hard for me. It hit hard because I work with a lot of folks that have experienced that and are redefining what their dreams are. I've experienced that in some degree, but again, a loss of a personal dream that can cause grief. A loss of a romantic relationship, separation, divorce, life's transitions, change. That's a big one for me. Can cause grief. Retirement. I know that personally with my mother. Retirement. When you dedicate your life to a job or a position, and then it stops. What does that look like for those individuals? They will grieve. The spirit will still process that as a loss, right? Someone that experiences a miscarriage, that is a huge loss. Loss of financial stability. We can't really even recognize the way that folks take that. We see a lot of self-harm with that one. Loss of one's health, another big one. Loss of safety, huge. Selling a home, that can cause grief. Absolutely. And also a cherished, like a loss of a cherished dream that you hold true and close to yourself that can no longer be attained. So these are just examples. I'm sure we can add more, but this is just a list of examples of what can cause grief so we can have a better understanding, right? That folks recognize that they may have grieved or are grieving one of these things that they didn't even know is a part of it, right? Or kind of associated that. Yeah, it's interesting.
Dr. Ann, that's so interesting because, like you said, when you think about grief, you often just associate it with loss of a life, right? Family
Yeah.
member, friend, and you kind of have that grieving process. But as you just stated, there are many ways to kind of experience that sorrow or that loss.
Mhm.
One example that came to mind while you was talking was my wife and I were going through the home buying process, and
Mhm. Mhm.
people told us, until you sign the line, like, don't really kind of invest. But like, we
Yeah.
found this home, uh, and we loved it from the outside. When you walked through the door, you was like, this is it. In my head, I moved in, like I was there.
Right. Right.
And it turned out you go through the process and it found out that like somebody outbid us. And it was like you didn't get it. And like it was so like distraught. Like I felt like I was grieving. I was grieving for probably like the next week. I was dreaming about it. I was going through it. I felt down. It wasn't a lot that was really kind of picking me up, and you kind of had to push through. But it was like, this is I didn't even move in. Like, this is just an emotional. I just was so invested in it. But we joke about it because the way God works is, whatever happened before us, it fell through, and we actually ended up getting the house. But like that week or so before, it was really just down, and it really felt like you know I was going through it, and like I've never really felt that except for at the loss of a family member, and
Mhm.
so it felt weird, and I thought something was wrong, and so I'm really glad you said that because I was like, yo, how did we? Why was I going through all of that? But it was something we really cared about, and I'm really glad that we was able to kind of get it and kind of be there. But that's just how God works. But that was a grieving experience.
Oh, absolutely. And when you're speaking, it's like the loss of expectations. Like when your expectations
Yeah.
don't happen, that's one of the biggest things that I think as humans we all go through, where we have an expectation and it doesn't happen the way we want it to happen, and that is instant grief or regret. Remember, that's also a part of grieving is painful regret, like what I could have done that I didn't do, and now it's too late. That's the part of that grief, right? And I'm sure that ran through your head. If we only added more money, if we
Mhm.
only bid it higher, if we right, all of those things kind of aid to that feeling of grief. But thank you for sharing. That's a great example.
Now, Dr. Ezra, I do have a question. When I was in my psych classes, we talked about grief and we talked about the stages of grief. Can you talk to us about once you know you're going through grieving, can you talk to us about those stages? Is that something that we all go through, or do we all go through? Do we hit every level? Let's talk about the different stages and kind of what that does to us.
Yeah. So um, there's generally 5 stages. That's what we start with. Are starting to expand a few stages, maybe around 5 to 7. But again, they're around the same and the same kind of understanding, right? Thing about the stages of grief, and I'm going to get into those. You don't always hit all 5 or 7 stages. Some skip, and that's completely normal. So I just want to say that. So with stage one, um, we understand that as denial. Yeah. This is when a person has a strong response to pretending that the loss didn't happen or change isn't happening, right? So denial gives the person time to absorb the news and begin to process it. It is a common defense mechanism. It shows up in other areas of our lives, right? Not just with grieving, but it's one of the first stages that happens with the loss, right? It's just hard to fathom that this is happening to you. And a person may go straight into denial mode that this is not happening. This is not my life. And they're not really kind of ready to confront the truth. right? We can see this in like a breakup or a divorce where it's like, oh, the person's just upset. It's not really over. They'll be back tomorrow, right? That's just an example. Um, with the loss of a job, the person may say, oh, it was a mistake. They were mistaken. They'll call me in the morning, right? They're not in a place to really um, identify with the loss. With a loved one, she's not gone. He's still here. Um, they'll come around the corner any moment, right?
Mhm.
So that is stage one. For stage two, it takes a quick turn. Anger is step two. The thing what we see with anger, it's an easy emotion to display. So oftentimes, if someone is angry, um, especially in therapy, you'll ask them what's the underlying emotion, because anger is something that is societally acceptable, especially in men, right? And so it may again, it's acceptable for folks to be angry, so they may show up at that instead of expressing themselves through tears and vulnerability. So anger is number two, whereas denial is a coping mechanism. um, Anger is masking the effect of the feeling of the loss, right? Again, it's an easy emotion to go to and display. um, with anger, there that person oftentimes is just again hiding the emotions that in the pain that they're carrying. It may be misdirected to other people, such as the person that passed, a loved one, an ex, an old boss, just someone that they can kind of externalize that anger to. We see it often. We see it all the time. Um, while the rational brain knows that this anger doesn't really help, or no, there's no one to blame per se. Maybe not, depending on the circumstances, right? But in that moment, the emotions are so intense that that's just all that they can kind of display at that time. So it may mask itself as like bitterness or resentment, rage or fury. Um, but not everyone will experience this part of grief. That's why I said all stages are not necessarily met. Some may skip this. But if someone does experience that, just know oftentimes it is a part of the process, right? The healing process of grief. Um, if, for example, breakup, I hate her, I hate him, he'll regret it, she'll regret it. Um, Loss of a job, maybe like they were horrible bosses, I had a terrible supervisor, I hope they all fail, right? So it's just this overt display of anger that you may see with someone processing grief or loss of some sort.
Dr. Anderson, let me pause you right there on stage two.
Yeah.
Because you talked about a lot of things happening right here with anger, and I know we've all experienced it as far as people being angry or people being in denial. And so, as a family member, somebody who is going through this with them, how do you deal with that? Because there's obviously a lot of emotions, and rightfully so. Uh, but it's, if a family member is lashing out, and we know, how do you cope with that? I guess as a third party, I guess.
Mm.
That, how do you deal with that? Do you let it go? Because this is a natural feeling, like you said. This is going to come out. This is one of the stages that we all experience. So, but how do you react? As a third party.
That's a great question. I think it depends. I don't know if there's like any one way. It depends on how the person like is lashing. Like, are they physically harming someone? Are they, if it is, like you said, just that person being angry, but they're kind of, you know, keeping to themselves or just having a moment, I think it's okay to just allow them to be in that moment and not kind of minimize how they're feeling. We have to be careful with that. And we'll talk more about that because it's kind of hard to talk to folks about grief. It's kind of hard to find not support, but folks may not know how to show up for you with grieving. And I want to normalize that, right? So it may be even harder for that third party to come in. So if we can kind of step back and give them a moment, I think that is absolutely okay. But if it is getting to a place where they are kind of harming others physically or even emotionally, kind of checking in and seeing with what additional support they may need. But it is a part of the process, and I do want to normalize that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Anderson, I want to take a pause right now. I know we're on stage 2 and we have a few more to go, but I really want to go through this commercial and we'll come back and finish the rest of the stages of grief. You guys stay tuned.
We know how to treat the colds and the coughs. We know how to treat the bumps and the bruises, the cuts and fractures. But how do we treat, I can't afford a day off work to see a doctor? How do we treat, I've never had a doctor who speaks my language? How do we treat, I don't know how to connect with some of my patients? How do we treat, you're not listening? We can't treat what we cannot see. So we have to look closer and see what we're missing. People, patients, misdiagnosed, misunderstood, overlooked. These are the people left out of a system charged with helping them. And it's up to us to find them in our communities, in our relationships, in our data. We're meeting them where they are, discovering who they are. We're taking an honest look to understand their healthcare needs and delivering effective ways to reach them. We don't have all the answers, but together we can find the way to address the gaps in our healthcare system, to provide something better, to find more chances to save more lives. It won't be easy, but we can help make it right, because no one should be missed.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. If you've been with us from the top of the show, we've been talking about grief and how it affects us and the stages that we're going through. Before we went to break, we have covered 2 stages so far. We talked about denial and we talked about anger. And so, Dr. Anderson, I want to give you the floor back to talk about stage 3. What is stage 3?
So stage 3 is bargaining. So this is the stage where an individual may want to kind of regain some sense of control. And so they may ask the questions of what if, right? Or if only I did this, things will have a different outcome. This stage oftentimes is when folks may bargain with the divine or whomever they kind of are connected to spiritually, where it says, you know, if you do this, I'll do this, right? If you allow this person to survive, I'll give myself, or I'll do this, or I'll provide this, right? It's just a bargaining, and it's just a way to again regain a sense of control, because with grief and loss, you do feel out of control, right? Because we don't have a say, and so we do see this oftentimes with grief, because you do want to kind of feel as if you have a sense of control, but oftentimes we find that we don't, right? So an example is this: if I only had more time, she would have stayed, right? Or if I got to see them before Tuesday, I wouldn't feel so guilty. All those things, all these kind of bargainings, the what ifs, and all those kind of aspects of the thing called grief. And it's unfortunate, but it is a part of the stage. The next stage we see is depression. And so, whereas anger and bargaining can feel very active, depression may feel like the quiet stage of grief. A lot of times, folks may not even be knowing how you're feeling and what you're going through in that moment. You may feel like in the early stages, you're running away from emotions. With the sense of depression, it's like you really kind of embrace them. And you try to begin to work through them in a more helpful way. You may also choose to isolate yourself from others to cope with the loss, and I have personally experienced that. With this stage, it doesn't mean that depression is easy or really well defined. Like the other stages, it just depends on the person. They may feel like foggy or heavy or confused. It may feel like, it's kind of this inevitable kind of loss and kind of landing point where they can't really kind of pinpoint what's happening. But there's still a kind of a sense of direction. And that's the thing with this stage. So oftentimes this may be where people kind of contact a therapist and get help through get help with their like coping mechanisms in this kind of process, because if they're not careful, it can get worse. And so it's really up to the person to kind of determine the severity of it. But again, this is a normal stage. And so I don't want to necessarily scare folks, but know that depression or just a sense of deep sorrow may be a part of the grieving stage. An example is, I don't know how to go forward without this person here. Who am I without them, right? That's an example. The last stage is the acceptance stage. It doesn't mean it's necessarily like a happy stage or an uplifting stage. It just means that this person has moved past the grief or the loss, right? It also means that you've accepted what has come and you kind of understand what it means for life now. Does that make sense? Like, life continues to go on and you're in a place of acceptance that this is my life now without that individual. And that's the acceptance stage.
So I know one of your specialties is spirituality when you're with your clients and counseling. How can spirituality help individuals, especially with this acceptance space? Because I know, a lot of the time when I'm experiencing grief, I start thinking about life on the other side, which is largely what religion is. That person's in a better place. They're watching over us, and so that kind of helps me get to that acceptance stage. But from your perspective, how does spirituality kind of help people progress through these stages?
Yeah. A lot of times with one spirituality is really kind of connecting what they've learned from their grief, right? So grief and loss doesn't have to be a bad thing. A lot of folks find lessons and understanding from loss. They find ways of coping through loss. And it's important for us, Ray, to recognize that loss is inevitable. It really is.
Mhm.
And it's so hard and may feel morbid, but it is our truth. And so a lot of times when folks have experienced loss, oftentimes like back to back or more than once, they start to get it. They start to understand that this is a part of my life experience and I cannot die here spiritually, right? If I am still left in the physical realm, I do deserve to live. And so oftentimes we work through finding meaning. We work through honoring that person through maybe creating like an altar or writing a poem or just extracting like life lessons, because the idea is that this person was able to be with me for a moment, a year, 10 years. That we are grateful for those moments, right? It's like we'd rather have those moments than never have them at all. And that comes with the risk of loss. You see what I mean?
I see.
That's spirituality. That's just the understanding that it's a blessing when they come, but recognizing that we don't know how long the blessing lasts. And that's our reality.
Dr. Anderson, I have one more question while we're still talking about the stages, right? And so my question is about the length. Is there, I know you touched on it in the show opening, but there's 5 stages you went through. How long does it take to go from each stage? Does each stage kind of vary, or does it take a year to go from stage 1 to stage 5? Like, what does that look like, or what is what's the scale look like?
Yeah. So yeah, grief differs from person to person. So there's no exact time frame to adhere to. You may remain in one stage for months and skip over other stages entirely. It's expected, it's typical, it's normal. And it takes time to simply go through the grieving process. So there's no set duration for each stage or anything like that. It just depends on the person. And that's that's just grief. That is just grief. I wish there was, and I don't even know if that would be helpful, to be honest. I don't know if we want to tell people like it takes a year each, who wants to hear that? And so it just depends on the person, that they may hit every stage, that they may skip, they may hit one stage and go to acceptance. It just depends on their grieving process.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand because they always say, funerals and weddings kind of bring out the worst of people. And so the way you grieve might not be the way other people grieve. And so
Yeah.
sometimes you kind of have to know that to accept or to at least kind of interact with other family members, because sometimes people are like, girl, just get over it. You know what I mean? Like it's been a year, or it's been 2 years, or something like that. And so you have to know and have that empathy, which is something that we're going to talk about soon. But you got to be able to kind of have that empathy and let people kind of go through these stages on their own. But with that being said, Dr. Anderson, I have to go to my favorite question: is how much is too, like, when should somebody start to seek help? Like, when is it, all right, you got to get it back. We got to get back into the world. You know what I mean? When is it time to come see you or to seek help from a professional?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So it gets a little messy a little bit, only because folks can grieve for years and not necessarily need help or seek help, right? That grieving is it's absolutely can be normal and a part of one's life. But again, we find issues when it interrupts someone's living and their daily kind of day-to-day experiences, where they can't do it or it's completely interrupted, right? Where they're missing work or missing school or not getting out of bed. And so that's kind of when we know. For example, when there's grieving kind of disorders. So that is a great example of kind of like a barometer of like when, right? And I'll give a few examples of what that looks like. So one grieving disorder is called prolonged grief disorder, and it's a feeling of intense intense grief that persists and cause kind of problems and stop them from continuing their lives. That's a little bit different from someone just grieving and being kind of sad throughout the day about a loss, right? This is a complete interruption of this person's life. It's characterized by intense and persistent grief that causes problems and interferes with someone's daily life. And so I'll just give a few examples of what kind of characteristics will identify like this person in regards to a disorder. And this is extreme. We may see marked sense of disbelief about the death, where they're just unable to accept it, avoidance of reminders of that person being gone, deep in sorrow, identity disruptions, right? So them feeling as though a part of themselves is gone. Remember when I was talking about we can't die in that moment, because that's a huge part of grief, where you allow a part of you to also go with that person. You see that a lot, and I was almost close to that before in life. Difficulties reintegrating kind of back into society with friends, right? Pursuing interests, planning for the future. So these are just signs where it's like, okay, you definitely need additional support from a professional. And then it's another disorder, because you said, what is too much grief, right? So I'm just going the extreme. Another disorder called complicated grief. This person is having difficulties accepting the death long after it's occurred, right? So they may feel stuck or preoccupied with the person who has passed on, and it disrupts their daily routine. So you're going to see that a lot with disorders. It's all about this person being able to maintain their lives and the person not being able to maintain their lives. And that's how we kind of decipher severity with someone who's just simply grieving, in that it should begin to pass or subside a bit more, right? Mm-hmm. In these instances, it does not. It stays very extreme and severe for this person, where they can't get back to their normal routine. This person may experience like intense longing and yearning for that person, intrusive thoughts or images of their loved ones, a denial of the death, imagining that that person is still alive, right? And so these are examples when it's extreme and you need to see. But again, it doesn't have to turn into a disorder. Just know if it is not subsiding after around like 6-ish months, that's usually 6 months to a year, that you definitely may need to check in with someone or a support group or grief support group or friends or family, and just be able to kind of get the support that you need.
Yeah. Dr. Anderson, I want to give everyone who's listening kind of some tools, right? You know, say we come to see you, or even before we have to get to the point of a professional, what are some healthy coping tools or skills or things that we can do to kind of cope so that we may not have to come see you, but so that we can grieve in a healthy way? So what does that look like?
Yeah. Just know that your first extreme experience of grief may help with the next extreme experience of grief, right? And so personally, I did seek professional help, but with the next loss, I didn't have to because I had the tools, right? So it's okay if you do, and it's okay if you don't need to, like Ray said. But you want to acknowledge your pain. Remember I said about that myth? If I don't acknowledge it, it's not there. That is not true. You have to acknowledge it to work through it, right? We have to confront grief as it comes and allow those waves to come, right? So when the wave comes, instead of hiding from the wave, you just sit in it and you rest in it and you process it as it comes, because as a wave comes, it goes, right? And so don't be afraid of the wave. Sit in the wave and just know that it will leave eventually, and you'll process that and it'll come back and you'll process that. But we shouldn't necessarily be staying in it. It should come and go. Acknowledge our pain. We want to accept and acknowledge that there may be triggers and different and unexpected emotions that will come. There's so many triggers out there. To be honest with you all, you can be looking for birthday cards and you see a card for your grandmother and she's passed, right? There's a commercial on TV, reading a book, there's so many triggers. So we just want you to recognize that there's triggers out there that you may or may not recognize, and give yourself a moment to pause if you are triggered. Okay. Next, we want to understand the grieving process is unique to you. So we don't expect you to have it done in 5 months, 5 years. It is completely unique to you, and you take all the time that you need because we don't want to ignore it. We want you to process it as it comes. We want you to seek support, oftentimes in person as much as we can, because it is important to know that you are not in this by yourself. You are not alone. And because loss is inevitable, we all are in a position to talk to one another and support one another about what it feels like to grieve, because it is such a common experience. We want you to support yourself emotionally and take care of you, not only emotionally, but physically, and whatever that needs to do. So I know with grief, it may be associated with the weight gain or weight loss, right? And so we want to be physically healthy, but we also want you eating when you have hunger cues and making sure that you are taking care of yourself. You want to recognize the difference between grief and depression, right? And we talked about that. Turn to friends that you love and support, and that love and support you, and that you can experience vulnerability with in a safe environment. Because again, when we're able to share our stories in a safe place, that's where healing truly happens, right? And so we can do that with the third party and all of that. However, just know that you also have community and supports that are there. And then we want to maintain our hobbies, right? We want to do our day-to-day activities as much as possible. We want to stick with our interests. We don't want to lose those things, right? We want to keep ourselves healthy. We want to be outside exercising, moving our bodies, because remember those natural endorphins that happen when you move your body, right? And so we want to kind of increase that or kind of keep it consistent as much as possible. And you want to plan for those triggers. So think about those birthdays, those anniversaries, right? Those times of the year that will remind you of that individual or that event. So you want to plan for that. Do you want a therapy session around that time? I know some of my clients plan around events because they know they're going to need that. And so just think about those triggers, plan for it. I'd rather you plan than it be caught off guard for it, right? And then real quickly about that grief and um, depression. So we talked about what grief is, that painful regret, um, that feeling of sorrow and sadness. Depression looks a bit differently, right? So depression, I want us to be clear about that, is when it really interrupts our day-to-day activities where we have no interest, like our interests are no longer kind of a thing, where we're unable to get out of the bed, where we have a complete lack of appetite, where we're sleeping too often or sleeping too little, right? So these are ways to differentiate between having just grief and being depressed, right? And so we are constantly checking in. If you are in a place where you even have questions or you are uncertain, feel free to check in, like I said, with a professional or ask questions, but you can't go wrong with, even if you find out that you're not depressed, you can't go wrong with talking to an unbiased individual that is trained to help you and to support you. So those are some tips. I think I covered um, as many as I can. There are therapists that specifically are trained in grief counseling, right? Or yeah, therapy, grief counseling. And so I do suggest you go to someone that is trained in this area, because they'll be able to kind of dive and identify the emotions that are kind of keeping you in a stage of grief.
Dr. Anderson, this has been such a great conversation, a much needed conversation, as we all experience grief at some point in our lives. And I thank you for really helping us get through and giving us the tips and kind of helping us um, define and understand grief at this level. Because a lot of times people go through and they don't know what's happening or what's going on. And so that's really the reason for this show, to make sure you have the tools and the resources that you need, that we need, to kind of be the best version of ourselves. And, we have to deal with this and accept it. Dr. Anderson, before we leave today, do you want to close us out? Any final thoughts that you want to leave people with to kind of help them move on with the rest of their weekdays, lives?
Absolutely. As I was listening to you, Ray, something else that came up about kind of grieving. I encourage you all to cry and scream as loud as you can, maybe in a pillow if your environment doesn't allow. But there is so much energy attached to a loss, right? And so I want to encourage you all to not hold back. Um, and I know this personally, do not hold back from the energy that comes up from your body that needs to be released. Because a lot of times with grief, we'll stuff it down and we'll suppress it as if it's not harming us or hurting us. And I really want to encourage you all to let it out. If it's not through crying, if it's not through screaming, it can be through exercise, it can be through kickboxing, it can be through other avenues, but it has to be released out of your body, right? That type of energy and loss and pain doesn't do well sitting in our bodies, and it can manifest itself in other psychological or emotional or physical ways in our bodies, right? So I want to encourage us to release it in any avenue that is obviously safe, but it doesn't do us any good with sitting in that um, emotion after it's asking to be released, right? Good. Also, grieving is necessary. Grieving is inevitable, and it is something that, again, we all can share. So I want you all to pour out. Um, in spaces that you do feel welcome, that you do feel loved, and you do feel safe enough to be vulnerable with those individuals, because there's so much healing in knowing that you are not alone. For next week's episode, we are going to be tackling empathy. So please join us next week, Saturday at 11 a.m. Thank you all again.
For more than 40 years, Boston Scientific has relied on our spirit of relentless innovation to advance science for life. We have the privilege and responsibility to deliver higher quality, less invasive, and more accessible device solutions, and the need has never been greater. Boston Scientific technologies are used to treat roughly 30 million patients around the world each year. Across our business, our products are supported by vast clinical data, including bench testing, randomized controlled trials, and ongoing real-world evidence to ensure the highest quality products make it into the hands of our customers. And we're always looking for ways to provide even more effective therapies and solutions. We invest over $1 billion annually in research and development to sustain a robust pipeline of meaningful innovations. We continuously strengthen our manufacturing and operations capabilities with artificial intelligence and advanced microelectronics to create devices that are smaller and smarter. And we're collaborating with our medical partners and physicians to advance digital capabilities with remote device support and a broad scope of training and education programs. Advancing science for life is also about supporting our employees and the communities in which we operate. Now more than ever, we rely on our values to guide our company as a global business and as a global corporate citizen. We're working to help confront healthcare inequities and social injustice, not only with financial contributions, but through volunteer service, advocacy, and expanding market accessibility. We're also focused on environmental initiatives that move us towards our goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. The unmet needs are great, but the future of healthcare is bright. Our innovation centers provide a place to explore opportunities, examine solutions, and see what lies ahead for medicine. Together, we can continue the relentless pursuit of innovation to help everyone live longer, healthier lives and make a difference all over the world.